We're in Matthew chapter 8, and Jesus' authority as the king of God's kingdom is on full display. In Matthew 5 and 6, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, people were marveling at Jesus' authority as a teacher before he even did anything. And now, people are going to marvel at Jesus' authority as a miracle worker. Jesus has healed in Matthew 8 already, both by touching people and just by the power of his word. Jesus is showing power over disease, disasters, demons, sin, and death. And then in Matthew 10, Jesus is going to send his disciples out to exercise his power as king. These demonstrations of Jesus' authority all have a purpose. They are to show that Jesus can save us from our sin. In the first half of Matthew 8, we saw that Jesus not only healed, but he cleansed the unclean. Lepers, Gentiles, and unclean spirits. Jesus spent his earthly ministry gathering up sin and all of sin's effects in order to carry it to the cross. The passage last week from Matthew 8 ended by quoting Isaiah 53:4, showing that Jesus is the suffering servant by saying that he took our diseases, our uncleanness, our infirmity upon himself in order to take it away. And now, in the second half of Matthew 8, Jesus is going to show his authority over discipleship, disasters, and demons. I want you to notice especially how death and the sea are features in all three of today's stories, showing that Jesus has authority to judge sin as the Son of Man. So first, Jesus has authority over discipleship. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. That's the Sea of Galilee. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." But Jesus replied, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." There's parallels to this story in Luke 9 and in an extended conversation about the cost of following Jesus in Luke 14. Luke 9 includes a third request of someone to follow Jesus who wants to go and say goodbye to his family first. And then Luke adds a fourth request to follow Jesus at the end of the next story from the demon-possessed man that Jesus is going to deliver. Now, Jesus called some people to follow him as his disciples, but he called others to go or to stay as witnesses, like the leper last week and like this demon-possessed man that he's about to deliver this week. He sent them as witnesses so that Jesus could keep on moving and staying hidden and get to everyone in Israel. Now, Jesus has been calling disciples throughout this section of Matthew. Before the Sermon on the Mount, he called Peter, Andrew, James, and John from fishing. In the next chapter, he's going to call Matthew from following him as a tax collector. And when Peter, Andrew, James, and John were fishing, they had to leave both their family and their livelihood in order to follow Jesus as a disciple. That's what these two disciples who are talking to Jesus are struggling with leaving: their family and their livelihood. And the first disciple is too quick to promise that he can follow Jesus without counting the cost, but the other is too slow to follow Jesus because he understood the cost. This statement, "I will follow you," or Jesus saying, "Follow me," is what we're talking about is becoming Jesus' full-time disciple. And the fact that Jesus is about to cross the lake, to escape across the lake from the crowd, to stay hidden, this crossing of the lake is what causes the crisis that requires these two disciples to have to choose if they're going to follow Jesus or not. And do you notice that both of these guys are described as disciples? The second guy is described as another disciple. That means the first guy is also a disciple. Both of these questioners are already disciples of Jesus, meaning that they are students, followers of Jesus. But what they're actually talking about now is like becoming a student in seminary who not only figuratively, but literally followed the teacher or rabbi around in order to learn from him. And the way you paid for your tuition was by working and serving the master so that he could keep teaching. And it's often said that none of Jesus' disciples had been to seminary, but I would argue that they had been to seminary for 3 years under Rabbi Jesus. This was a seminary course they were enrolling into. Now, disciples can also refer to any student or follower of Jesus' teaching, even if you're not the ones who are following him around. It's interesting that a follower or a disciple is not often used as a title for Christians outside of the narratives in the Gospels and Acts. The word disciple is used 294 times in the Gospels and Acts. It is used 0 times after that. Isn't that interesting? A follower as a noun is used 9 times total and only 1 time after Acts. And to follow, even as a verb, following Jesus as king, his way, his word, his commands, or his example, is used 155 times total, but only 13 times after Acts. Okay? What we're talking about here is literally following Jesus as his disciple enrolled in a class. So, do you know what Jesus' followers or disciples are called in the New Testament after Acts? Actually, the word Christian only applies 3 times. It's only used 3 times in the whole Bible. Brothers is used 196 times after Acts, children of God 63 times, and saints 42 times. You want to use a biblical word to describe who you are? Those are the words, even more biblical than Christian. That's interesting, huh? Okay, a disciple, number 1, comes up and he calls Jesus teacher of the law. Or rather, he's called a teacher of the law, and he calls Jesus teacher. And that's the word for rabbi. He's putting Jesus and himself into the same profession. And it's interesting that a teacher of the law wanted to follow Jesus, and Jesus tries to talk him out of following him, like John the Baptist had tried to talk the Pharisees out of getting baptized. But he says, I'll follow you wherever you go. This actually sounds like it might be a quote of what Ruth and Orpah said when Naomi was leaving and they wanted to go with her. This might be literally a Bible verse he's quoting. I'll follow you wherever you go. But do you remember in this story he might be quoting, Ruth followed Naomi back to Israel, but Orpah turned back when she realized the cost. And Peter, also, who's a follower of Jesus, famously overpromises later on in his ability to follow Jesus anywhere, wherever he'll go. Jesus' response is that birds of the air have somewhere to go, but he doesn't have somewhere to go. Remember in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus talked about birds of the air, he talked about them trusting God to provide grain for them without farming. But he says even birds have nests. Jesus trusts God to care for him as much or more than the birds and the flowers trust God. And then it's interesting that he says birds of the air and foxes. This could be a double entendre here. Do you know what the Roman symbol was on all their flags? It was a vulture. It was an eagle. The Roman rulers could be what he's referring to as the birds of the air. The only other time a fox comes up in the New Testament, it looks like it's the common nickname for Herod. He might even be making a reference to the fact that the leaders, the Roman leaders, including Herod, have pretty nice palaces, but if this guy wants to follow Jesus, if he thinks Jesus has a palace he's headed to, he's wrong. Jesus says he's going to have no place to lay his head. This is going to be a mobile ministry with no palace. It's not going to be a picnic to follow Jesus. In fact, it's going to be a cross to follow Jesus. Did you know that vows of poverty, even among monks, made sure you only got serious people who wanted to become monks? It's like Jesus is saying that. Are you serious? Jesus is telling this disciple to count the costs before he promises to follow Jesus. Which brings us to the second disciple, who is another disciple. This other guy is a disciple too. They both already follow Jesus as a teacher figuratively, and they're asking to follow Jesus literally. This guy calls Jesus Lord instead of teacher. This is the word for sir, master, or king, or the Lord God of the Old Testament based on context. And Matthew is again pushing us to ask what it means for us to call Jesus Lord. In the Sermon on the Mount, it's clear that this Lord is calling him the judge of the final judgment. And the second guy says, let me go bury my father before I come with you. This actually sounds like Elisha's request to say goodbye to his parents when Elijah called him to be his follower, and he found him plowing a field. And Elisha's request is even more strongly alluded to in the version in Luke 9, because Jesus says the one who has his hand on the plow shouldn't turn back if he's in the kingdom of heaven. Okay, again, it's interesting. This may also be an Old Testament quote here. Now, it was the duty of sons to bury their parents. You can see that throughout Old Testament Bible stories. And it's right for us to care for our aging and dying parents, as Peter was doing. It's literally the last story was the fact that Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, who looks like he's living with Peter and his family. And yet, our love for Jesus must be greater than our love for our parents. This is a strange phrase. This phrase, let me go bury my father, could mean because my father's funeral is happening right now, he just died. And if that's what it means, this is an extreme cost of following Jesus. Like when Jesus told the rich young ruler, just sell everything you have and come follow me. This might even be hyperbole, like when Jesus told us to poke our eyes out in order to prevent sin. Jesus might be making a point here that he, is an extreme point. But this, let me go bury my father, could mean, let me wait to follow you until later in my life after my father dies. See, Jesus' time on earth was a unique time that could not be missed. And Jesus' disciples had to give up time with their families in order to follow Jesus. This, let me go bury my father, could mean, let me wait to follow you until I can afford to be your disciple after my dad dies and I get my inheritance. That might be what he's saying. There was also a custom that after a year after your father had died, they would dig up the bones and rebury just the bones in a box called an ossuary. So it's possible that his dad is already dead and buried and he could follow Jesus, but he's saying, let me stay home the full year after my dad died in order to complete tradition. We don't have enough information to know exactly what Jesus is saying. The point is that we should love and honor our parents, but our love for Jesus has to be greater than that. Okay? Let the dead bury their own dead, is what Jesus says. This probably means let the spiritually dead bury the physically dead. Or more generally, it could just mean let this dying age die. There's more important things than these physical things you're asking me about. Come on, follow me. Okay? Do you notice the titles used for Jesus here? They call him teacher, they call him Lord, and Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. This is the first time this title is used by Jesus. This title is used 31 times in Matthew, 14 in Mark, 25 in Luke, 13 in John, and then only once in Acts and twice in Revelation. Did you know that in the Gospels, it's always either Jesus or someone quoting Jesus who calls Jesus the Son of Man? This was Jesus' favorite title for himself. In the Old Testament, the Son of Man is the Messiah in Daniel 7. It can mean just a man in Psalm 8. It can be the prophet God called Ezekiel, son of man. Or it can mean the whole nation of Israel in Psalm 80. The Son of Man ultimately shares in God's glory cloud in Daniel 7. And within the gospel, Jesus uses the Son of Man as the one who will be the judge at the final judgment. That's the most common thing it means. It also means the one who will die, and it means the one who ministers on earth. Jesus clarifies that he is the Christ, the Son of Man, when Peter confesses him later in Matthew 16. And Jesus will be executed for claiming to be the Son of Man from Daniel 7, who would come on the clouds to judge the world as God and King of God's kingdom in Matthew 26. And the Son of Man is Jesus' title as judge of the final judgment in Revelation. And the Son of Man has come to forgive sin as only the actual judge can. We're going to see that next week. If someone in court says you're forgiven, it can be a very nice thing to say. But if the judge in the court says you're forgiven, you can go, it means something. When Jesus says, your sins are forgiven, your sins really are forgiven. Trust him. Okay, so what happened with these guys? At the end of this conversation, Jesus and his disciples get into the boats. But we don't know for sure whether or not these two disciples are counted among the disciples who get in the boats with him or not. I think there's hope for them because when the rich young ruler came to talk to Jesus, Matthew clarifies that he went away sad. The fact that Matthew doesn't tell us whether these guys went away means there's at least as good a chance that they got in the boat with Jesus than that they didn't. It's unclear for sure. I think this ambiguity about whether these guys joined Jesus or not is Matthew's way of inviting us to use our imaginations. Not only about what happened with these two disciples, but about ourselves. Do you accept that Jesus is the teacher, the Lord, the Son of Man? Do you understand what it means that Jesus is claiming to be these things? Are you Jesus' disciple or follower, learning from him and following his teaching? Does that already describe you? Would you get into the boat if Jesus asked you to follow him? Or would you stay or go if he sent you as a witness, like he did with the leper? Are you too slow to promise that you're willing to follow Jesus? Or are you too fast to promise that you'll follow Jesus and not be able to follow through? Have you counted the cost of following Jesus? Do you know that it's not going to be easy, and are you willing to do it anyway? Okay? The story continues with Jesus' authority over disasters. Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. And without warning, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waters swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went, and they woke him up, saying, "Lord, save us! We're going to drown!" He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and he rebuked the wind and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." This story is paralleled in Mark 4 and Luke 8. And Jesus calms another storm after walking on the water in Matthew 14. You see, the setup here, faith is being expressed in rest or not worrying. That's how Jesus defined faith in the Sermon on the Mount. And now Jesus is literally resting, sleeping through the storm. Jesus just told this disciple, "I have no place to lay my head," but now he can sleep through anything. having nowhere to lay his head is also the same thing as being able to lay his head down anywhere and sleep. We can rest in God wherever we are, even if we're not welcomed where we are. We're going to see that when he gets to the other side of the lake. Now, it's interesting. Jesus is teaching again. He teaches before he calms the storm. They come to him saying, "This storm is out of control." And Jesus says, as the boat is going up and down, "What are you guys afraid of?" And I could see them pointing like, that's what we're afraid of. Look. Jesus calls them, "You of little faith." Do you remember that the centurion, he just healed his son? He called him someone of great faith. It's another Gentile he's going to call the woman, the Canaanite woman, great faith. 3 of the 5 times that Jesus says to the disciples they have little faith, they are in a boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. This is a place where the fact that you have little faith is visible. 2 times it's in the middle of a storm. Now, the word for storm here is seismos. Do you hear our word for seismic activity? It is literally the word for an earthquake also. This storm is an earth-shaking storm. And storms would come off of Mount Hermon about 10,000 feet above the Sea of Galilee and just sweep down into the lake. They still do. And in the Old Testament, we actually have God using storms in lots of stories. I just have a handful of these. Do you remember that Jonah, he's out on the Mediterranean, but God uses a storm and rescues him through it? Do you remember Elijah and Moses talked to God out of storms? Do you remember that Moses was crossing the Red Sea and God parted it, brought the people through it, and then destroyed the Egyptians with it? Do you remember that the ark, God brought his judgment on the world in the form of a storm and a flood and saved his people out of it? When we think of big storms and big seas, we should be thinking about God's power, but also about God's judgment. They're connected in the Old Testament. Storms and seas are controlled by God. And in fact, in the very beginning, Genesis 1, it says that God's spirit or wind was hovering over the waters. Right in creation, God has been there over the waters in control of them. And the last time that Jesus talked about a storm at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he talked about the way that a storm can either knock your house over or your house can survive. The storm of God's judgment is coming. Will you survive it or not? That's the question. Do you see the titles that they're using for Jesus here? First, they call him Lord. And then they say, "What kind of man is this?" That's an interesting title. They don't know how to fill in the name on his name tag. They say, "Lord, save us. We're going to drown." That's literally, "Lord, save us. We're going to die." This is probably Matthew playing a double meaning with us again. Would this be a good prayer for us to pray to Jesus? "Lord, save me. I'm going to die." It's a really good prayer that applies more than just being out in the middle of a lake. Now, the fact that Jesus is asleep proves he's a human. The fact that he can calm this storm with a word proves that he's divine. And the disciples start out afraid and they end up amazed. And being amazed at Jesus' authority over the storm, as the people were amazed at Jesus' teaching, is the way people respond to Jesus. But they also look like this amazement includes fear of Jesus as God, the judge, the Son of Man. They're almost more afraid of Jesus now than they were of the storm. You see, creation obeys the creator and sustainer, and that's who they have with them in the boat. And God rebukes the sea and it obeys him. God conquered David's enemies, and David described it as God stilling a storm. Figuratively, the sea was the chaos of God's judgment that Jesus can save us from. Do you remember that not just in Judaism, but in Greek and Roman gods, they're the ones who are in control of the storms, using them as judgment. Even Martin Luther, when he was almost hit by lightning, saw that as the lightning bolt of God's judgment that had to be dealt with. This is a way that God communicates both to Christians and non-Christians about his power and ability to just take us all out with a lightning bolt at any moment. And Matthew invites us to ask this question about what kind of man Jesus is. Do you believe that Jesus is the creator who can control physical storms? And do you believe that Jesus is the judge who can save you from death and the storm of God's judgment? If you cry out with the disciples, "Lord, save us, we're perishing," you can trust, relax, rest in God's promise to forgive your sin and save you from the storm of God's judgment. Which brings us to Jesus' authority over demons. When he arrived at the other side of the lake in the region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. "What do you want with us, Son of God?" they shouted. "Have you come to torture us before the appointed time?" Some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, "If you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs." He said to them, "Go." So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. Those tending the pigs ran off, went into the town, and reported all this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. Then the whole town went out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave their region. There's a parallel to this story in Mark 5 and Luke 8. And Jesus cast out lots of other demons. We'll see them as we go through this section of Matthew. And the interesting thing is that in Mark and Luke, one of these 2 men wanted to become Jesus' disciple, but Jesus sent him as a witness instead, like he did with the leper. They kicked Jesus out of town at the end of the story, but Jesus left them a missionary. Interestingly also, Mark and Luke only mention 1 person in these stories, while Matthew mentions 2. Matthew actually tells us there's 2 people in lots of stories that Mark and Luke only tell us about 1 person. This is not a contradiction. If I said, Jesus healed a demon-possessed guy, and you're standing there beside you and you say, "I think there was 2. You say, "Oh yeah, there was 2. But I wasn't saying there was 2. I'm just telling you about one of them." Okay? And it's very possible that Luke, who was interviewing witnesses, talked to 1 each of these pairs. So Luke's telling the 1 story. It's also possible that Matthew, writing to a Jewish audience, wants to make sure we get 2 witnesses, which is required for testimony in a court of law. He wants to make sure he's got all the witnesses. There's also a suggestion that he might be a more precise counter as a tax collector than others. But the interesting thing is, it's actually Mark that tells us that there was 2,000 pigs. He just says there was a lot of them. And he doesn't tell us that there was a legion of demons either, but that there's enough to kill this big herd of pigs. Okay, they're on the other side of the lake. That is the Gentile side of the lake. You can see that we've got pig farming going on. This demonstrates we're on the Gentile side of the lake. And this demon-possessed man, this word is literally demonized. This is someone under demon oppression or control, not rightful ownership. The fact that we say demon-possessed makes it seem like the demons own this guy. They do not own this guy. They don't own anything. And he's coming out from the tomb. Death is an unclean thing. They're unclean spirits. Matthew's going to call them that in Matthew 10. And they go into unclean animals, linking this story to Jesus taking up our uncleanness and infirmities that's been going on in the rest of Matthew 8. Healing and delivering from demons is closely related in these stories. It's all about Jesus' authority. Now, these guys were so violent they couldn't even be chained up anymore, it says in Mark. And like other demon stories, demons like hurting the people that they are possessing or oppressing. But notice that this man was violent, not able to levitate or do other miracles. We should not give demons more credit than they're due. Okay? They say, "What do you want with us?" Meaning, why are you here? Are you here? Why are you here on earth, or why are you here in this Gentile territory? What are you doing here? Have you come to torture us before the appointed time? That's the day of the Lord. The final judgment is the final judgment of demons too. They're afraid of hell, which is the fire prepared for the devil and his angels in Matthew 25. People end up going there, but it's not made for people. It's made for them, the devil and his followers. And this time literally means the date. Like Pearl Harbor was a date that will live in infamy. Judgment Day is a date in the future. And they're asking because they want to be sent into these pigs instead of being sent into the abyss or hell, which is what they ask in Luke. And the title they use for Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus was already revealed as God's Son at his baptism. And immediately following that, the devil tempted Jesus to question God's love for him as his son. And Jesus passed that test. Likewise, these demons know that Jesus is God's Son, but not in a saving way. The disciples are only going to come to accept Jesus as the Son of God when the next storm is stilled in Matthew 14. And Peter will confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, the Son of Man in Matthew 16. And Jesus was ultimately executed for claiming to be the Christ, the Son of God, and the Son of Man in Matthew 26. And Jesus was mocked and then recognized legitimately as the Son of God as he hung on the cross. This is who Jesus is. He's God's Son. And these demons are begging to be sent into the pigs, and then the herd rushes down the bank into the lake. This is proof that demons exist because mental illness cannot go into pigs. In fact, these pigs were some distance away. They were not close enough for the pigs to be scared off by the action going on by this demon-possessed man. Jesus' ministry is to tie up Satan and steal his stuff back for God's kingdom. That's how Jesus is going to describe his ministry in Matthew 12. Jesus has already successfully resisted the devil himself, and now he's going to rescue others. Now, I'd like to point out that this isn't stealing or even murdering pigs. Everything belongs to God. Do you know that when all of us die, you could say God could have kept us alive longer? It's different when God interacts with things than when we interact with things. And one of the commentators I read pointed out that Jews hearing Matthew's story would not have been worried about these pigs at all. We go, hey, what happened to the pigs? Other people hearing this story would not have thought that. Unclean animals being controlled by unclean spirits is normal. This would have just been all expected here. And they died in the water. The pigs drowned in the Sea of Galilee. Do you remember what the disciples were just afraid of in the last story? Drowning in the Sea of Galilee. The demons were happy to hurt these pigs just like they were happy to hurt the men that they possessed. The devil loves death and destruction since he's been doing that since the beginning. Now, there's actually two possible meanings of the words here, that the herd of pigs drowned or that the demons drowned. I think the pigs died. But we've got a picture here of the sea being God's judgment, the place of the attack by Gentiles coming in off the sea into Israel. They did not have good feelings about the sea. And the pig's death is a picture of the demon's defeat and final destruction. First at the cross and then at the final judgment. They're rushing down into God's judgment, the abyss, the sea. And do you notice how Jesus got rid of these guys? He said. Jesus controlled the demons with a word, as he did disease and disaster. Demons were more active during Jesus' ministry than any other time in the Old Testament or the rest of the New Testament. But we should not underestimate the devil. Keith Green has a song singing as the devil called "No One Believes in Me Anymore," saying that the devil can get away with whatever he wants because no one believes in me anymore. But we shouldn't overestimate the devil either. Martin Luther, in A Mighty Fortress Is Our God, talks about how God can protect us. And one of the lines that he said as he was going into his trial at Worms, where he was being tried for his life, ends up in the song A Mighty Fortress Is Our God. Martin Luther said, "I will go to Worms, though there were as many devils there as tiles on the roofs." They had red tiled houses, and Martin Luther said, even if there's that many devils there, God can protect me. Though the world with devils filled, Jesus can subdue them. Our fight is not against people, but the power at work in them. Do not shoot the hostages. If you're rescuing people who are captives, do not shoot the hostages. Do you remember how Martin Burnham died when he was held hostage? They shot him in the rescue attempt. The people under the devil's control are not our enemies. They are the hostages. And we have the armor of God. We're clothed with Christ in order to be able to take our stand against the devil. The armor of God and being clothed with Christ are the same thing. We can rest, just like Jesus slept in the boat. Jesus slept in the boat knowing that there were demons on the other shore, just as much as knowing that there was a storm. You can rest in God and trust him. Now, these people in the end plead with Jesus to leave their region. Do you remember that the demons were begging with Jesus to let them go into the pigs? And then Jesus casts the demons out, and now the people are casting Jesus out. This is not a happy ending to this story. And in fact, the fact that these demon-possessed men came from the tombs, and now the people are coming from the town, we might have an intentional literary comparison between these two groups. We've got two groups of people that are rejecting Jesus. Gentiles reject Jesus too. In the last story, Jesus was amazed that a Gentile accepted him, but not all the Gentiles did. And Jesus is willing to minister to Gentiles and to Jews. This is good news for us. We get in on what God intended for his people. He extends to us. Okay, so why were these guys afraid of Jesus? They look like they're afraid of Jesus, but they also look like they're mad at the loss of money because of the pigs being killed here. Jesus taught that people are worth more than birds, more than sheep, and here that they're worth more than pigs. But people don't agree that people are more important than animals or money. I didn't think about this analogy until during Sunday school today, but what if there was two guys who kind of hung out in our parking lot here, and it was scary, and they were violent and really having major problems, and Jesus showed up and he cured them, and in the process flattened all the buildings on our property? Would we be more excited, wow, these guys are in their right mind, or would we be going, you destroyed everything else? Would we do the math right and go, wow, people are more important than stuff? Or would we be likely to go, we think we want you to leave, Jesus? You see, this is the same amazed or fearful response that the disciples had when they calmed the storm. And the Gentiles have this additional fear. They associate people who do miracles with magicians, not prophets. They're scared of Jesus because he's a scary guy who can do all kinds of weird stuff that they can't control. And again, Matthew is inviting us to consider if we would respond to Jesus by asking him to go away if we were there in these stories. Do we love money and things more than people who need to be rescued from the devil? And do we recognize Jesus as the Son of God and the Son of Man? And if we do recognize him that way, are we afraid of Jesus as the one who has control of death and judgment and the devil? Or do you recognize Jesus as the only one who can save you from death and judgment and the devil? You see, ultimately, these stories are about Jesus having authority over sin. In the first half of Matthew 8, Jesus is the one with the ability to gather up and take upon himself and absorb all of our sin and all of its consequences, including uncleanness, without becoming unclean himself. Jesus was willing to touch unclean people, including lepers, Gentiles, and demon-possessed people, and to enter into unclean places, including their homes, their bedrooms, their beds, and touch them, which should have made him unclean, but instead he absorbs the uncleanness and takes it away. He makes them clean. And yet, Jesus didn't have to get close enough to heal. He has the authority to just solve problems with his word. And now in Matthew 8, Jesus is the one with the power and authority over discipleship, disasters, and demons. Jesus was recognized as a teacher with God's authority to teach us as his disciples. And they marvel at Jesus' authority even when he was just preaching. But they continued to marvel when he calmed storms and cast out demons with a word. And Jesus was recognized as the Lord, Master, and King with the authority to lead us as his followers. And sometimes following means staying with Jesus in order to learn, and other times it means going or staying where Jesus sends you as a witness so that other people will learn about Jesus. And Jesus was recognized as the Son of God with the authority to judge even the demons. God recognized Jesus as his son by speaking and sending his Spirit at Jesus' baptism. And Jesus trusted God's word that he was God's son during his temptation by the devil. And Jesus invites us to call his Father our Father, and Jesus promises to share his victory over the devil with us. We pray in the Lord's Prayer, deliver us from the evil one, because Jesus can do that, and he will. And Jesus claimed and proved his authority as the Son of Man to judge when he controlled this storm. To remember that God threw Pharaoh into the sea in judgment and the whole world into the sea in judgment in Noah's day, like these pigs were destroyed and like the disciples were afraid that they would perish in the sea. But in Jesus, God protects us from the rising flood of his judgment and throws our iniquity and sin into the sea in forgiveness instead. That's one of my life verses, Micah 7:19. God throws your sin into the sea in forgiveness. Hear the good news. The Lord Jesus is God's Son. God in the flesh, the Son of God. Jesus came to earth as a man, the Son of Man, with God's authority to judge as both God and man. And Jesus lived a perfect life, but gathered up our sin, uncleanness, and disease, and took it all to the cross with him. Jesus died the death that we deserve, and was plunged into the sea of God's wrath, which washes away our sin, uncleanness, and disease, and he rose again in order to give us his cleanness and his perfect life. And Jesus has returned to heaven, where he's able to wash away our sin and uncleanness whenever we ask. And Jesus will return to judge the living and the dead, and the devil and all his demons, when they will be washed away, plunged forever into the lake of fire. And Jesus already has the power to free us not only from our own uncleanness, but from the uncleanness of spirits. Believe in, rest in Jesus. Acknowledge Jesus as the teacher, the Lord, the Son of Man, the Son of God. Don't try to send Jesus away once you see his power as the judge. Call out to him with the disciples, Lord, save me. I'm drowning. I'm drowning in my own sin. Then follow him, learn from him, go and witness where he sends you. Adopt his priorities of care for people over things. There's a reason that the gospel comes with a baptismal bath. In Jesus, all our sin and uncleanness is forgiven and washed away. And this message is for the whole world, all who will believe, even you.